Today's special episode is a roundtable discussion about EIP 3074, AUTH and AUTHCALL, and EIP 4337, Account Abstraction Using Alt Mempool, two very different approaches to enabling smart contract accounts. To discuss the past, present, and future of 3074 and 4337, I'm joined by Matt Garnett, aka lightclients, a developer contributor working on Go Ethereum, Gregory Markou, aka Greg the Greek, CPO at blockchain development firm ChainSafe, and Joseph Delong, CTO at Astaria and former CTO at Sushi. It was fantastic getting these three talented and opinionated developers to the table to discuss the social and technical processes it takes to improve the EVM. My thanks to Pedro Gomes for helping bring this episode together. I hope you enjoy the show. As always, this show is provided as entertainment and does not constitute legal, financial, or tax advice or any form of endorsement or suggestion. Crypto has risks, and you alone are responsible for doing your research and making your own decisions. Light Client, Greg the Greek, and Joseph Delong are all here to talk about 3074 versus 4337. I'm very excited. Are you guys excited?
Totally, yeah.
I can hear it in your voice.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm ecstatic.
This is as ecstatic as it gets, huh?
Nothing like pedantic, EVM opcodes.
Oh my God, this is going to be a great one. Okay, so today, Light Client will be repping 3074, Greg the Greek will be repping 4337, and Joseph, I think, will be taking pot shots opportunistically. Is that right?
I don't know. I think I'm all on the 3074 camp.
Oh, really? Okay. Wow. Okay. So it's two.
I'm actually in both. I think they have their I actually think they each have their own unique benefits, but I'll get into that in a bit.
All right. Awesome. So we're going to have a variety of opinions. Before we get started, just in case, maybe there's listeners who don't spend all day on Twitter, maybe let's run through the room. And if you can just say where you work, where you got your handle, and maybe what it is about blockchains that motivates you. I think that'll help frame the conversation a little bit. So maybe we start with Light Client. Matt Garnett, where are you working?
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I'm working on the Go Ethereum team these days. I've been with them for like a year and a half now. Before then, I worked at Consensus on a team called Quilt. That's where we did a lot of our work around 3074 and Account Abstraction. We worked on this EIP 2938 3 or 4 years ago now. And yeah, still trying to push these things along however I can. I got my handle by trying to find a nice GitHub username because I used to be called Color with hyphens between every letter. And the people I was working with at the time said that they couldn't be bothered to type all those hyphens anymore. So I had to go on a journey to find myself a new name. And I think all the clients are pretty neat.
UX improvement.
Yeah, that's what I live for.
And yeah, what is it about blockchains that motivates you primarily, if you can narrow it down to one thing?
I like that we're creating a new way for humans to organize. Like we've never had the ability to have unstoppable agreements between different humans. And so I think that's a pretty interesting aspect of it.
Awesome. All right, Joseph, you want to go next? I guess your handle's not that exciting, but where are you working?
Right, yeah. That was my Christian name, So yeah, I co-founded a company called Astaria. We work on NFT collateralized lending, and I cut my teeth in ETH core development, and that's why this subject really interests me in particular.
Great, and that's what about blockchains excites you too?
About blockchains, yeah, I think what Matt said is pretty interesting. Yeah, self-sovereignty, like the ability to basically, there's no real legal layer for mediation on it, and I love that aspect.
Great. And Greg Markou, Greg the Greek, where did you get that name?
Hey, yeah, really big into frat life. A long time ago, like in high school, maybe before that, it was just a play on of someone else doing their name and their nationality or something. So I'm Greek. That's there's not much more to it.
Got it. And ChainSafe, what does ChainSafe do, and what do you do there?
Yeah, I'm one of the co-founders at ChainSafe and the current CPO, and so I focus on the product side. We do a bunch of stuff in terms of the R&D world. So we kind of got our claim to fame, so to speak, when we were building reference implementations of different blockchains. So for Ethereum Consensus, Polkadot, and Filecoin. And then outside of that, we maintain a bunch of libraries in the Unity space, and as well as we've been maintaining some like Web3.js for the last couple of years. But I could ramble for a while, but anyway, yeah.
And what is it about blockchains for you?
I mean, I think everybody else kind of already hit it. I think one of the more interesting sides, though, for me right now is the fact that we're able to work on so many different pieces of like new emerging tech. And I mean, as an, like an engineer or developer by originally, the ability to work on all that cool stuff is amazing. But with the amount of capital injection we're getting, we're honestly like advancing a lot of different parts of technology so much faster than they would have happened before. Like ZK probably wouldn't even be around right now if it wasn't for us. And I'm really excited for like things like that.
Awesome. All right. So I guess maybe Matt, do you want to get started or you guys tell me, but I think one first question might be like, where did 3074 come from? What was 2938? Matt, you want to take that?
Yeah, I can give a pretty quick summary, and then we can just dive into the debate. Or I guess they can give an introduction to 4237. But yeah, so 2938 was born out of some work that we were doing with ETH2 Phase 2 execution environments. And it was sort of a combination of some ideas that had come from there and some ideas early on from Vitalik. From the very beginning, I think even in 2015, Vitalik had this post called On Abstractions, and he talked about trying to build a blockchain that abstracted as many of the different elements as possible, because that was really the special thing about Ethereum, was that you had this virtual machine and you could create any kind of abstraction that you wanted. And so with 2938, we tried to take those ideas that he had about abstracting what accounts were and what it meant to have a transaction included on chain, and sort of come up with this minimal idea of how could you completely abstract the validation logic in a transaction. Because that's really what account abstraction was back then. It was, we wanted to abstract the cryptography or the way that we decide that a transaction for a certain account is valid. And it's morphed to mean a lot of different things since then. But that was the original thought process. And so 2938 was this relatively simple EIP that proposed a way to integrate accounts abstraction to the core protocol. And it addressed like a lot of the problems that that just generally comes from accounts abstraction, and 4337 sees these things, particularly around how do you deal with denial of service attacks on bundlers, and in 2938's case, denial of service attacks against the miners or the block builders, since we didn't really have the concept of bundlers back then. And we found some interesting things there, and some of those things were brought into 437. And around that time, we realized that 2938 wasn't really going to fit into the hard fork meta in the near future. And we started looking at other ways to try and improve the UX on Ethereum. And so I went down this rabbit hole of trying to come up with these like bespoke transaction types that would allow for people to sort of aggregate the operations they wanted to do into some like batched transaction type, and it allowed for somebody to sponsor that transaction. And it was a super rigid thing. And at the same time, my coworker Sam Wilson was thinking about similar things, and also, with 2938, there wasn't really a good way to sponsor accounts abstraction transactions, and so he was thinking maybe there could be a combination there. And so Sam actually came up with this idea for 3074. It started out as a pre-compile and sort of morphed over time. I came on board like relatively quickly because it seemed like a really good idea, and it sort of morphed over time to this thing that we have today, which has these two opcodes and takes a signature from EOA and lets that EOA perform like other tasks on Ethereum. And so 3074 isn't really account abstraction like the truest sense, but in the way that a lot of people have come to understand what account abstraction is, which is like really allowing smart account features, things like batching of transactions, things like recovery of transactions. 3074 does provide those things to most users.
Great. And do you think you could explain like in detail the auth and AUTHCALL and really how 3074 works, what the proposal is?
Yeah, so the proposal for 3074 introduces the two opcodes, like you said, auth and AUTHCALL. And the TLDR of how those two opcodes work is auth takes a signature, an ECDSA signature, and does a recovery on that to figure out who signed. It takes a signature and the message, and so it does an ECDSA recovery to figure out who signed that message with that signature, and it saves that address, the signer, into some sort of context variable within the EVM inside your frame. Inside your frame, you have a lot of other contextual information, things like the memory usage, things like who the message sender is. And so we just extended it to include the currently authorized account. And so after you have used the auth opcode and you've recovered that address into this context variable, then you can use the AUTHCALL opcode, which would perform a call just almost exactly like the normal opcode call works, except instead of the message.sender being the contract which is invoking AUTHCALL, it's actually the sender. The sender is set to be the signer of the auth message, and this is a relatively simple idea, but it's a very powerful primitive which allows externally owned accounts to sign arbitrary messages. It's just up to the smart contract, which we call an invoker because it is invoking the auth and the auth call opcodes. It allows the EOAs to bestow a lot of power upon an invoker to do complicated tasks, things like transaction batching. And so you can imagine you write a smart contract that says, if I receive a signature over a batch of messages, then I will verify that signature over the batch of messages, make sure that's correct, and then I will give it to auth, which, because the signature was already correct, we know that the auth will set the next sender to be this address, and then I can call AUTHCALL, and I can just go through a for loop and iterate through each of those operations and execute them in this batch form. So there's a lot of more advanced ways of utilizing this method, and I think there's like cool things that can be done, like signing a one message off chain and using that later as an account recovery mechanism. But that's kind of the rough EVM level description of how it works.
Great. I don't know if Joseph or Greg, you want to jump in with any more context on 3074?
I'd just say for 3074, the interesting aspect for me is that it essentially lets another contract like LARP as the message.origin, which would be normally the signer, or whoever signed for that message, and like basically that, like, it's such a simple solution, right? Like, I would say that the original sin of Ethereum was ERC20 approvals, and this essentially like undoes that aspect. In fact, I can't actually count the number of hours that I've spent fighting the approval abstraction in contracts, because it's basically, it basically creates you need to be, the message.sender to approve, right, in ERC20s, 721s, and 1155s. But you don't have that ability to do that as a contract. So basically, whenever you go to like Uniswap or wherever, right, and the first thing you do is an approval transaction, the reason that you have to do that as its own transaction is because of that design, right? And that's like the key piece that this eliminates. Yes, it can like, I think 3074 definitely, it enables a pathway for account abstraction, but it's not like, I would say, not like explicitly account abstraction. It has has properties that allow, individuals to develop their own account abstraction. I think an appropriate analogy might be something like EC Recover, right? EC Recover allowed us to build EIP 712 and not the other way around, right? It's like a simple tool that's used to make, maybe a more complex standard.
So just to clarify, basically, once you authorize a contract to act on your behalf, that contract can be the TX, or you will still be the TX origin when a transaction is propagated by someone other than like an EOA?
Yeah, totally. You'll still be TX origin, but you're allowing that contract to act as message.sender, whoever signed the message. And typically what we're saying is that's going to be the same person who's tx.origin.
Got it. And maybe could you spell out exactly how that solves the approval problem that you were dealing with?
Yeah, totally. So if I have an invoker, right, then I allow that invoker to act as me, right? So like I allow it to act as my EOA, and so that invoker contract can do an array of transactions, right? Like we don't have any, like there's actually no real design constraints on being able to execute multiple meta transactions in a single transaction using one contract. That's like actually a pretty common like design. But the problem is that the approvals always have to come from the message.sender, and then by basically like letting the the invoker wear the like message.sender mask of me, my EOA, I allow it to do approvals, and then in the next step do something like the transaction that you actually wanted to do. Maybe it be a swap or whatever.
Got it. Greg, I don't know if you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, like the elegant design of 3074 is that it protects EOAs and doesn't require users, in the sense that like you don't need to move funds, change wallets, migrate accounts. Everything's just like there for you. And it's because it's fully backwards compatible to the existing EOA model. And that's what I really like about it, is that, unlike 4337, you have to, in order to like really use it, you have to go through that process of saying like, I am comfortable and ready to migrate all my funds from maybe my cold storage wallet to a brand new smart contract wallet.
So 3074 is basically adding functionality, adding the ability to delegate to contract, but without requiring a transition process.
Yeah, exactly. Which is like honestly the really, really nice aspect of it.
So we should get into talking about 4337 and give like the high level of what it is, but why did 3074 not, or why has it so far not had traction in the same way that 4337 has, if it's so much simpler?
Core devs don't want to add new EIPs. Sorry.
My impression is that the research began on 4337, and that was kind of like a preferred design. But I think the initial research on that design began with like the like so the like kind of, I would say the like to steelman the 3074 case is if I can allow a contract to LARP as me, right, then I can basically have the user sign one transaction that can like it can like yoink all of their assets from their wallet, right? So that's a pretty huge design flaw. But I think that the 4337 design initiated essentially from a standpoint of, we don't have that kind of like design flaw, but essentially it's an emergent property of account abstraction that allows you to do this. It basically every account abstraction design at its core like has the same fault, right? And 4337, I think, started from the standpoint of like, we won't be vulnerable to such a thing, and kind of shoot, 3074 is kind of being exposed to its vulnerability. But now, especially with the talk of enshrinement, it's basically subject to the same exploitation.
Okay, so I think we should give an overview of 4337 now. I don't know if Greg, you want to take this, but what is the abstraction in account abstraction in terms of 4337?
If hand waving and giving a very light example, 4337 is effectively supercharged meta transactions. What's really happening under the hood is that you have a 4337. The standard defines a smart contract wallet, kind of similar to Nonces Safe, and it defines a few extra parameters on how someone can interact with it. And so there's kind of like two key players in this ecosystem. There are now what we call paymasters, and there is an entry point contracts. Entry point contracts act as this gateway that is very similar to how Matt described the 3074 invokers. So it's this gateway contract that allows paymasters or EOAs, just own like the owner of like an EOA as an owner, to submit transactions to their 4337 wallet. Very lightly put, with an entry point, a paymaster who's doing kind of like meta transactions, so to speak, can just sponsor your operation on your behalf via the entry point contract. So it adds this like trustless layer of allowing people to do that. That's basically all it is in essence. There's a lot of stuff built on top of it.
Yeah, it introduces, like, it's a much more complicated thing in the sense that it introduces like a whole new mempool of these user operations, right?
Yeah, so like that mempool doesn't really exist right now. It's just centralized services. So you would pick your service provider and just submit the signed user ops to that service provider. We don't have really a decentralized mempool. That's more in the wish list to come section of it.
I see. I don't know if anyone else wanted to jump in at this point.
This might be a good moment just to say that comparing 3074 and 4337 isn't a completely fair comparison because they are doing a bit different things. And maybe an analogy could be that 3074 is like a screwdriver and 4337 is like a full tool set with a box of screws and a manual for best practices for using your hardware. And I say that because I think that 3074 would, like, to utilize the screwdriver, to utilize 3074 to the similar extent you would with 4337, you would have to do a lot of similar things. And so this infrastructure they have around the paymaster, this infrastructure that they're trying to build to come up with a permissionless transaction pool of user operations, this is stuff that 3074 as a good protocol-only EIP doesn't discuss at all. It is really just a tool that can be used by people who want to build more fully featured ecosystems. Whereas 4337 is a much more opinionated application level standard, which is trying to propose what this whole world would look like. But I think that's why these things look a bit different. I do think there are benefits to 3074 versus 4337, but the simplicity aspect, I'm not sure if it's like a completely fair argument for 3074.
I see. And if we were to like strip away some of the additional parameters that are suggested by the spec in 4337, what are the kind of design philosophy differences between 3074 and 4337 at the basic level?
I think in 4337, it tries to be a more account-driven design. And what I mean by that is if you look at the control flow graph of a transaction that utilizes 4337, then you'll sort of see that the machinery will go through that account's wallet. So there will actually be an account in the state trie, which has some smart contract wallet code. And after the paymaster processes the validation, it will call that account to execute its transactions. And so as you're following that control flow graph, you go from the paymaster over to your smart contract wallet, and then your smart contract wallet will then send its batch of user operations out to the various smart contracts. And that's a nice story, and it's extremely clear if you're able to look at that kind of flow in a graphical way. But 3074 takes a different approach, and it's a little bit more validation focused. So I wrote a post a few years ago in response to a post Vitalik had written sort of critiquing 3074. And I proposed a bit of a different way to think about what a smart contract wallet should do, or what is this special thing that they're doing. And the argument I tried to make was that smart contract wallets, really what they do is they do validation. And so we should lean into that. And so for EOAs, we don't really need to call anywhere to validate if an EOA signs something properly, because we already have this cryptographic mechanism available to us with EC Recover. And so it's straightforward to just figure out if an EOA signs something correctly. But for a smart contract wallet, we would, in the 3074 world, have to call out to that smart contract wallet and ask them, is this a valid signature for the domain it's signing and for like whatever your special access policies are? And then it would come back to the 3074 invoker, and then that invoker would process that user's operations. And if you look at that in a graphical way, it doesn't really look as clean and nice. Like there's kind of this, leg that goes out to the wallet and it comes back to the invoker, and then the invoker does some things, and you sort of have to tilt your head and look at the from address on those calls to see that's not from the invoker. That was a special call from the wallet. And so, yeah, in that sense, there's some critiques that it's a bit hacky. It's not as clean from the theoretical sense. It might require a different way to fully reason about how things are acting in the EVM. And so, yeah, I think that would probably be the best way to just describe those differences.
Yeah, I think the biggest fundamental difference is because they are solving two different problems. 3074 allows us to take existing key pairs from the EDS from the SecP curve and just basically say it'll just give us full control over effectively just message.sender. And that's the benefit, right? It gives SecP message.sender privileges throughout smart contracts to basically fix bad standards set in the past. And I think that's the key difference. Whereas 4337 is just saying, hey, we need to standardize how smart contract wallets work. And in doing so, we've added a bunch of additional complex logic on top. I see 4337 as onboarding, an onboarding tool, whereas 3074 for the next, cliche, the next million people or whatever, but it actually is, because I don't think we're going to see traditional key pair, SecP curve key pairs being used in the next 2 years. Whereas 3074's entire, the real meat and where it gives us a huge benefit is to say let's still allow SecP curves to have usefulness and get around bad smart contract design patterns that have emerged.
Right. And I don't want to come off and act like I'm a big K1 bull. I think that trying to move to pass keys and trying to move to other ways of authenticating transactions is something that good and something that we should be doing. For me, something that 3074 really provided that I think the 4337 is still not quite provided, and that we're generally lacking, is that it creates a really easy and straightforward shelling point for wallet developers, application developers, smart contract wallet developers to focus their energy on developing standards around wallet interaction. I mean, even with all this 4337 stuff, and it seems like every season is account abstraction season, we don't really have a lot of native integration of account abstraction with dApps. And I've asked for a long time if we could have, something like Uniswap, where instead of doing this weird thing where you just treat every operation as if it's going to be a transaction, like it would be for an EOA, and you just aggregate them into your Nonces safe, and then you send that off later once you've got enough operations. I would rather be able to see in the UI that this is going to be two different operations, and if you have a wallet which supports batching, then it's going to submit that as a batch. And if you have a wallet that doesn't support batching like an EOA, then these are going to be two contiguous transactions sent. And I think the reason that we don't have that type of work happening is that the user base of smart contract wallets is still really small in comparison to EOAs. Especially if you think about it in terms of volume transacted and who are the most valuable users. And so 3074 to me unlocks every user on Ethereum to interact with dApps in a different way. And I think that's just the big catalyzing thing for developers. The developers don't want to put a lot of work in for something that's only useful for safe users, which are, whatever small percentage of total users that is. They want to build stuff that's useful for everyone. And so if all of a sudden everybody had a smart contract account, a smart contract wallet account, then I think they would be more excited.
That's interesting, because you're saying that basically by 3074, because it's offers such an, if adopted, would offer such an easy upgrade path, or not even upgrade, no upgrade required, that suddenly everybody, all existing install base, would be potential users of something like a smart contract wallet. But it does treat the, like with the 4337, it seems like we're moving to really separating the notion of wallet or signer from the account more clearly than it was in the EC Recover world. I don't know if you have any thoughts, anybody, on that.
So, I mean, like, first of all, I do like to make this clear that I don't the phrase account abstraction is super, super nuanced. Like, depending on the ecosystem you're in and how you do it, it's very differently done. I think like Near and Substrate, for example, have like really elegant key management solutions natively that offer and give what I think is like what account abstraction should look like. 4327 is just smart contract wallets. But to answer your question, I mean, the benefit of 4337 on like standalone is simply the fact that we can now submit arbitrary, like not arbitrary, but like very different key sets, right? And that's like why pass keys are making such a huge wave right now. And I think that's the important part, is like, this is just a giant UX unlock for onboarding. And that's why I also think 3074, I think honestly, once 4337 lands more officially and kind of like cements itself, we're going to see a 3074 like EIP, if not 3074, land into the EVM to basically unbrick standard SecP EOAs, because that is going to be a fundamental problem.
When you say
and
standard
SecP,
you mean K1?
Yeah, sorry, K1. Yeah. That's a much better, elegant way to say it. Because like they're not going to be bricked, but there's going to be so many problems with like actually the existing key sets on K1s.
You're saying post enshrinement even of 4337.
I mean, as much as I like 4337, I think enshrining it is a big ask.
Oh, so why would the K1? Why would they be bricked? Why would the K1 keys be bricked by 4337?
Not necessarily not bricked. Sorry, that's the wrong usage of terms. But I mean, like, their functionality is just so limited compared to like what's available through 4337. It's going to be like pretty obvious that like 3074 adds, because here one of the big counterpoints I think Vitalik even made was that entry points, or sorry, Matt, what do we call it? The contract?
The invoker?
The invoker was going to be like a bit of a security question, but like entry points are the exact same thing. That's a huge, like, everybody's using the exact same audited entry point. There's no problem here. I think 4327 will pave the way for a 3074 like EIP to get back in and basically give superpowers back to K1 wallets, which are like the standard, just like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good take, and I think it's important to highlight that 3074 and 4337 are not mutually exclusive things. You could totally have a world where a 3074 invoker implements a similar interface that the paymaster requires, the entry point contract requires. And I think that's a pretty interesting world because, like Greg said, it does unlock a lot of functionality, which hopefully gets built up around this 4337 ecosystem back to the people who have EOAs. Like, I don't know, we're kind of demonizing having an EOA, but having an EOA isn't necessarily a bad thing until it's extraordinarily cheap, if not free, to have a smart contract wallet on Ethereum. Then we're going to continue onboarding a lot of people with EOAs. And I don't think that's a bad thing, and I don't think there's that much that we can really do about it. And so we should try to embrace it by allowing them important functionality like batching and social recovery. And, you can highlight another one of Greg's points. 4337 is not going to get enshrined into the protocol as it currently stands. I've looked at the EIP proposal, and it's just far beyond anything that has been included into a protocol change in the recent past. So, I mean, it is an extremely big ask.
To add on to that, it's an extremely big ask if we can't even get BLS pre-compiles, which I've been fighting for like, I mean, I gave up on the fight. I think Alex Stokes took it over, and like, I think he's even given up on that fight, and it's been like 3 years. So like to get enshrined into the EVM is unbelievably challenging because of the amount of security overhauling that needs to be done. And I just don't think that'll happen. Not anytime soon.
How many humans need to be convinced of something for it to be enshrined? Roughly.
Oh, you're not going to bring up this, are you? You just, oh God.
I'm just curious. Like, is it 50, 5,000?
I would say you need to convince all the core developers that need to wake up at like 2 a.m. because your EIP that you tried to enshrine into the protocol was incorrectly spec'd. Which is the argument why BLS didn't make it, was because there was some really, really funky math. And I believe I believe it was Martin from Geth was just like, listen, like I can kind of understand this, but I don't think any other protocol developer can. So what happens when there's an implementation bug in it? And the more complex your enshrined ask is into a protocol, the less chance you're going to get that enshrined.
So it's not so much about the number of people, but their degree of caution.
Yeah, it's just like how many people can save a chain split at 3 a.m. and how much knowledge do you need to be able to do that? You know, if jump or call had a bug, you got like it could be fixed pretty quickly because like everybody understands how that works. Right? Like anybody could probably patch that bug and submit it to the client that has the problem. But if you have a super complicated 4337 implementation enshrined in the protocol and it fails, I don't know how many people would be able to just like make that patch, review it, and get it back out in time. It poses a huge, huge chain liveliness concern.
That's interesting. I mean, like, how many core developers do you think understand 56K1 like fully, like in the math and bounds and everything? There's lots of, gotchas in that design as well.
Yeah, but I think
we're okay with that because we've had it. So no, I'm just like, yeah, just if we're okay with that because we've had it for forever, or is it just something different?
I think the difference there is like that's crypto that's been rolled and hardened, right? Versus like arbitrary code. But like I also agree with you. I mean, I think the big thing with BLS, and maybe that's what you're hinting on, is the fact that like the problem with BLS was just like that curve and the way it was doing like the G1, G2 point was just super new. And it was just like,
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Crazy math,
Yeah, I think BLS is only like 10 years or less old, right? It was like 2014 or something.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there was only one reference implementation when you and I were working on what was ETH2 at the time.
That's how we did our client. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there was only one implementation that everyone could use. So like that's the that's where the problem is, and like you can translate that back to the 4337 enshrinement. Like there's not many implementations of it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, but if you look at other protocols out there for enshrinement that are a lot more aggressive with enshrinement, like Flow, for instance, is a great example. Some of their base primitives, like a fungible and non-fungible token, are precompiles that are accepted are enshrined, and I think that's pretty great. We waste a lot of gas on ERC20 transfers and 721 transfers and 1155 transfers and optimizations around those. Like how much like EVM developer time has been wasted like trying to optimize ERC20s instead of like enshrining them as a primitive.
Oh, I have no idea, but probably a stupid amount. Yeah. I mean, like I made that website, like what, approvals.wtf, just to like see how much wasted approval gas you've spent. And it was like, some people were returning like multiple single digit values of ETH. Like it'd be nice to have that stuff enshrined, But yeah. I think it's a problem of just like having an old network, right? That's why most of the researchers are telling everybody to just like not use Ethereum anymore and just use it as a settlement layer so that these L2s can get innovative. Like I think ZK has like been pretty innovative on AA.
Oh, interesting. From what I've seen, like on the optimistic rollup side, they appear often to be more conservative because they're kind of like wanting to maintain compatibility between the base layer and the L2.
They are talking about OPStack in 2024 adopting 7212 ahead of L1, or maybe if L1 were ever to do that. But the L2s do seem to be experimenting with that kind of thing, given they're trying to onboard a broader number of people. It's just the R1 curve. Greg, you mentioned that Near and others have interesting or more elegant account abstraction solutions. Can you say what appeals to you about those?
Yeah. So like in Near, for example, they have this like disassociation of your account and the keys natively in their VM. So you like register an account against, you like, it's kind of the idea of like key rotation or adding owners, but it's like natively built into the protocol. And so you really simply put, you just are basically like registering a key, like a key pair against an account that holds balances and things like that. I mean, so they have that built natively, and Substrate doesn't have it necessarily yet, but the way they do their key management allows you to be quite expressive. And so there's been some nice designs that have been put out there. But I think like the Near design is quite nice. ZK Sync also has a pretty decent implementation there, which the Clave team is been like really spearheading a lot of efforts.
They're also co-authors on the 7212 EIP. So essentially, that's like an something like an enshrined 4337 in the sense that, but it has a kind of canonical account implementation, I guess, is what you're saying on Near.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. And 4337 again covers. 4337 is mainly about the like TX pool, TX ops, and the entry point contract, right? Whereas and that's why I don't say it's like true account abstraction, because account abstraction would be that like your keys, the way your key interacts with the account natively is by default very configurable, right? And that's what Near does, for example, is they have that like really configurable right at the base layer without adding all this additional added complexity on top.
Right. I mean, I guess one thing we were getting to through this conversation is the direct comparisons between 3074 and 4337 are not appropriate, but maybe their intentions are something that we can contrast. So 3074 mentions that UX improvements are ancillary and that the leading motivation is really the sponsored transactions. And 4337, as you're saying, is more about this user op mempool. I don't know if anyone has any observations about those two different motivations and why one is proving more successful, or I guess your personal interest in either of them?
Somewhat controversial. I think in recent years, we've allowed more of this, like less decentralization and more, I would say like just like if we're reflecting on like MEV and the direction that we've gone with that, is we're kind of like allowing there to be, I don't know if I want to call them centralized operators, but like, operators who particularly benefit from, let's say, if it was like builder proposer separation or bundling, right? And I think that EIP 4337 goes a lot more towards that direction and kind of like creating an environment where a centralized operator can take some like advantages as opposed to kind of having more of a decentralized mempool.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And I don't think that's even controversial. I think that's straight up the case, is that we have become very complacent with saying that good 10x UX upgrades to Ethereum can happen like really lower level at the core and like with wide adoption with a mass amount of potential centralization attached to it. But I think like all blockchains are kind of going down that road a little bit, but we just have all the adoption, like 100x more adoption than everyone else. And it is quite a little bit sad to see that path.
I guess while we're in this kind of neighborhood, any hot takes on whether R1 is compromised?
What's R1?
SCCP, the passkeys curve.
They take K1, but they change the whatever the seeds are for it.
Right, but they were defined by the NSA. And
is that P256 or whatever?
Yeah, P256.
Is that?
And the NSA has supposedly lost the strings that were hashed to generate those seeds, but there's no open process about them. Anyway, some people use that as a reason for skepticism about integrating it into blockchains, for example.
Wait, are you serious?
Yeah, it's the same curve. It's just got these.
No, but like the NSA developed P256 and allegedly lost it. That's like an action.
I mean, this is why I think Bitcoin originally used K1 and why we used K-check 256.
Yeah.
since they're kind of the sort of end state of the cryptographic mechanisms, but before it gets the NIST stamp. Personally, as long as it's not part of the core protocol in the sense that this is like how transactions are instantiated, then great. If people feel good using it, they should be able to use it. And I think we should have a precompile for it.
Right. Makes sense. For people who are interested in this, there's an episode of the podcast Security, Cryptography, Whatever that was shared to me by Leo Lunesu. The episode's called Jerry Salinas Deserves a Raise with Steve Weiss, and it describes how this cryptographer who passed away in the last year or two, Jerry Salinas, who was working for the NSA and is the one who came up with those seeds, claims to have just forgotten, but the seeds came from him hashing a phrase that was something like his name, Jerry Salinas, deserves a raise, but he could never figure out what it is. At least that's the story that he told before he passed away. So if you're interested, Security, Cryptography, Whatever is the podcast. But yes, I see what you mean about, there could be a precompile as long as it doesn't compromise the essential chain security, then it's just whichever smart contracts decide to rely on it, it's their problem.
Isn't it a little bit crazy that there aren't any, like blockchains and crypto people are probably the largest consumer of like cryptographic devices in the world, and like that there isn't a secure element that's K1? And that feels like insane a little bit if you think about it.
From what I understand,
you're bringing out your tinfoil hat.
From what I understand, it's nothing wrong with the trusted execution environments in the hardware. It's just that the software doesn't provide K1 APIs, but there's nothing in the hardware that prevents them from doing so.
Oh, interesting.
That's what I was told by someone who understands more. That person, Leo Lunesu, who previously worked on P256 incorporation, or a contract for P256. He wrote a P256 smart contract verification contract in like 3 or 4 years ago. And he has told me that there's nothing in the secure enclave, for example, that prohibits it from having a K1 signing.
Oh, interesting.
For people who are interested about that, there's another episode of this show all about 7.2 where you can find out more about that stuff. Any other like crazy, I have some questions from the audience I want to get to in just a second, but any hot takes or controversial opinions you want to provoke each other with before we get to those? Joseph, you're all out of controversial takes.
Yeah, I mean, I just would say that the centralization around our, or not, I guess not centralization, like capture, right? That's happening around different parts of our protocol are derivative from our own inaction to kind of like solve the core protocol problems. Like how many companies have raised on EIP 4337? Like there's probably like 30 or 40 different EIP 4337 wallet providers.
You're saying that the premise of those fundraisers is that they must be able to convince VCs that there is some possibility for capture at the other end.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
I mean, one like a counterpoint might be that it is sort of the next generation of accounts, wallets. It's the next gen wallets seem to be coming out of this 4337 movement. So maybe the next MetaMask is one of them. But MetaMask, it has a certain kind of capture, but it didn't prohibit things like Wallet Connect or 1193 from emerging that kind of mitigated its amount of capture of the early software wallet market.
Yeah, but all these service providers that are bundling 4337 paymasters and doing smart contract deployments and forcing developers to go use their proprietary APIs so they can discover the 4337 wallet, because there's no standard way to find them, is precisely the problem. And that's why in PBS, Flashbots runs the market, because there's like no other convenient way to do it. The capture is like there just because of convenience.
Right. And maybe there's something similar with centralized sequencing and the hypothetical access to a trapdoor, but in practice, how many times have transactions been included via the trapdoors on these popular networks? Maybe 0.
How many times have we had a fraud proof?
It's a deterrent, Joseph.
Okay, it's a little off topic, but I want to ask you, do you think that all of these optimistic rollups are a house of cards? And if there was ever some kind of censorship, or if the centralized sequencers go down, is there like a cascading problem that's going to happen across all of these rollups, optimistic or otherwise?
I don't know how L3, 4, 5, and 6 is exit if the L2 fails. I've never gotten a good answer.
What if Base stops producing blocks
Right.
Does it have a consequence for the assets in Hop, for example? Like, are the Hop LPs just going to take the brunt of it and it's no problem? Or will these assets that are, on... it just seems to me like a huge problem. I don't understand it well enough. I'm curious if you have ideas.
I mean, technically, if the sequencer of an optimistic rollup goes offline to retain the safety and aliveness, there should be a way to post things to L1 and have them processed on the chain by anyone permissionlessly. Do they do that? Is it implemented? Does it work? I don't know. But if it doesn't, then that's not really the full optimistic rollup design.
Are you able to then recursively go down to other L2s, 3s, and 4s that are attached sequentially to those chains? Then I guess you would be able to prove those.
I think technically you could. But what is an L3?
An L2 anchored to an L2.
Yeah, that's one that you could probably raise some money from venture on, is a L3.
Any VCs here? ChainSafe's raising on an L3. No, I'm kidding.
I think, is it Arbitrum Orbit that does that? It's supposed to be a L2 for L3s to build on top of specifically.
I'm closing my ears.
I know. I mean, I know of some teams that have a roll up attached to base, which would qualify as that technically.
Do you think there's anything substantially better about these optimistic rollups, given the amount of centralized sequencing, et cetera, dependencies that makes them substantially different than when everyone was complaining that Polygon was misbranding its POS chain as an L2, when in fact it was a sidechain? Are they substantially better than sidechains if, in practice, nobody on this call believes that they'd be able to keep the chain going if those centralized parties stopped participating?
They're way better because you have an exit scheme.
But only if your assets are only if they're L1 native assets. But the premise of all this is that people will be working directly on L2s with L2 native smart contracts. So where are you exiting to?
I mean, if the system is constructed correctly, there should be an escape hatch that is triggered from L1. I'm not saying that's how they are implemented today, but I know that Arbitrum and Optimism on the optimistic rollup front are aware of these things and have the general structure if they're not actively working right now.
But that would apply to bridged USDC, for example. Or
bridged USDC from where?
I'll answer your question directly right now. I know exactly where you're going with this. In the interoperability space, if you are performing a mint burn style bridging directly across the canonical bridge, you are safe. If you use a bridge that likes to mint burn their own token, and the same would apply for liquidity pools on that, as long as the assets are coming through the canonical chain. The problem is when certain bridges designs decide that it's more efficient for them because it might be on revenue based or they want to get volume based to not use the canonical bridge natively for the best security path, then you are exploiting, you're circumventing the hatch. So when you do a bridge, when you're using bridges, the best thing to do is to make sure what is the safest security path to take. And that's always canonical bridges. Then it would be full consensus ZK proving bridges. Then it would be light client based ones and then MPC all the way down.
But that still depends on the premise that the assets are native L1 assets, right? Like if you have Arbitrum or Polygon native USDC, there's nowhere to exit to.
Polygon. Well, okay, USDC doesn't count though because you have CCIP.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know how that relates.
Yeah, that's the USDC. Okay, we'll use let's use DAI because DAI is the better example.
Let's do it.
USDC has its own settlement layer that's acts as an interoperability layer to ensure that mishaps are easily fixable.
So there's a big off-chain dependency that solves it for them, basically.
Oh yeah, huge. I mean,
so a native asset, or just it seems to me like there's some kind of cognitive dissonance in the premise that we're going to onboard 1 billion people by them interacting directly with L2s or 3s, whatever. Let's just stick to L2s for a second. But if the assets that they're interacting with, let's say they're making NFTs and they're interacting with friend tech and other kinds of interactive apps that live primarily on an L2, there is no exit for those assets, right?
I mean, just create a wrapper on L1 and create a proof that says I was the owner of this on L2.
Oof. I don't know if the Friendtech native smart contracts are compromised in the sense that their sequencer is no longer producing blocks and Coinbase disappeared or something.
But wouldn't like through 4844 like data availability posting, like wouldn't you be able to just prove some given state on a from that blob data to then like recover any data on the L1?
I mean, you still need to prove against the state root from the L2, and that state root might be in a blob as part of the state update. But if it's like an optimistic rollup, like the state update still needs to be accepted by the settlement contract, and to be accepted, you would go past the challenge period for the fraud proof. Because until then, you know, you can't really create a proof about something because you don't know if it's going to be fully accepted yet.
My other 2 cents about L2s is like we relied on them to scale Ethereum, but really did they scale Ethereum? Like we inherit the security of L1, but like now we need Aave on L1 and Aave on L2 and this other L2 and this other L2, and they all need liquidity. And then like each individual L2, if it gets too busy, it has the same scaling problems. Well, not the same scaling problems, but it has, you know, some finite upper bound for scaling. I actually don't care about the centralized sequencer. I don't think that's, you know, as big a deal as people make about it. I mean, if there were fraud proofs, it would be, you know, a lot better. But, you know, I don't think L2s really provide scalability. They just fragment all the liquidity, and then, you know, they fragment all the interactions to different L2s, and then there's like this L1 there. I just don't. I don't see it.
You know what though? I'm gonna throw the burden on like wallet developers though, and dApp developers for continuing to think that the Web3 architecture stack still looks like a Web2 one, where there is a single client and a single server backend, where the representation of server is a single blockchain. Like this is not 2017, you know. You can very easily blend all these assets together and treat them as a single asset. And I'll step on this further. It's like the fact that when I go on a wallet today and I look at my ETH balance and I have like 5 different L2s connected plus Ethereum mainnet, and it represents all 6 of those networks as having a different total amount of ETH, and I can't see the total amount of ETH, is fundamentally the problem. I think the interactions between L2s are completely solved if we just abstract away the fact that and accept the fact that like everything is just a unified asset across it. You know, if you want to go make a swap from ETH to like USDC, the wallet and the interface should just be aggregating every single chain and finding just the cheapest bundle across your entire wallet portfolio to like make that swap happen. Like you shouldn't, as a user, the fact that we have a network switching tab still is beyond me.
For sure, especially that in MetaMask it only shows 1 letter of the name of the network. But that all depends on the fraud proofs, et cetera, the security of these L2s being decent enough that you can abstract it away entirely for the user. But if they are fundamentally different and not particularly great, any of them, in practice, then it's a little bit scary to start just saying, well, ETH anywhere is the same, if it's not really.
I mean, if it has a canonical bridge with like the alleged escape hatch that Matt described, then it is.
I want to jump.
I think also WETH and ETH should be represented as the same asset, but that's a different story.
Yeah, wrapped tokens are terrible UX for regular people. I want
3074 can get rid of WETH.
How so?
Bingo.
Sorry, we can get to
let's do it.
Questions, but
how does it kill WETH?
TLDR, there's a really interesting post that Alex Berexazi wrote about 2 years ago on ETH Magicians called Getting Rid of WETH Using 3074. And it requires a specific version of 3074, which is not currently what's being proposed in the EIP, but it's just a small difference that allows us to transfer Ether from the account that is authorized. And so the way this mechanism would work is sort of like the approval mechanism for an ERC20. You would send this new WETH contract an authorization, which would just be a signature from your account. And it would put in storage that authorization so that at a later point, whenever some application that you're using needs to use WETH, then you would do a transfer from, and it would look up your old signature that you had previously submitted, pull that out of storage, and then give it to the 3074 auth code. And because it was a signature signed by you, then it will say, okay, this person is authorized, let them do the auth call. And with the auth call, you would provide a non-zero value. And so it looks like an ERC20 token, but it's actually pulling the Ether out of your EOA account. And so no need to have Ether in WETH, just have it in your account always, simply authorize it one time.
That's very cool. Are there any other 3074 applications that are spicy, tasty that we should mention before we get into the questions from the audience?
I think that's definitely the spiciest one. The thing that I am most excited about is the fact that with 3074, what you could do for onboarding a new user is you could have, as part of the onboarding process, say, sign this message that would allow some, threshold of other wallets to perform an action on your behalf, aka recover your account in case you lose your key. And so, you can imagine a world where MetaMask, you start up, you get your seed phrase, and then it says, list 5 people, 3 out of 5 of them could help you recover your account. And then all you have to do is save that message. They could save it in the cloud somewhere. It doesn't have to be posted on chain. It costs you nothing. But at some later points, as long as you can get that message back from whatever medium you stored it on, you could relay that on chain with the signatures from your friends who are going to help you recover your account or whatever recovery mechanism you want. And then your EOA, it sort of solves the problem of I lost my ledger in a boating accident.
But it doesn't solve my ledger was my PK is compromised. My seed phrase is compromised, right?
It doesn't solve my PK was compromised.
That seems like the big sort of deficiency. We kind of alluded to it earlier, the idea that post 4337, you could imagine 3074 revisited and then enabling EOAs to point to have auth and auth call to enable kind of smart contract wallets on top of it. But if you don't get key rotation, it seems a little bit deficient as far as the smart account dimension.
We could debate this for hours and hours, but ultimately I think that if you had your private key on a ledger or on some sort of hardware wallet and you put it in the ground 6 feet deep and you authorize some other accounts to do things on your behalf, which 3074 allows, then it starts to look a lot like a smart contract wallet. Yes, there's some private key that if you dig it out of the ground, you could use it to bypass whatever restrictions you put up, but hardware wallets are kind of safe and most people aren't getting targeted by sophisticated attacks in their homes. So I think for 90% of use cases, it kind of does the thing that people want.
All right, let's flip to the audience question. So Kate with a C on Farcaster asks, what implications do 3074 and 4337 have on state bloat?
I would say for 3074, in an ideal world, 3074 combined with EIP 1153 or 4337 combined with EIP 1153 that would allow us to do ephemeral approvals would reduce state bloat because there would be no approval storage anymore.
Wait, do you mind repeating the question? Sorry, someone called my phone.
Yeah, it was just 3074 and 4337. How do they impact state bloat?
Oh, absolutely terribly. 4337 is an absolute disaster in its current state. Absolute shit show. I call this, I put a tweet out today and had thanks to Matt also and some other people reviewing. We launched 2 EIPs today for 4337 to help with discoverability. The gist though is currently today you cannot detect a 4337 wallet that's been deployed by a third-party provider. So that could be Biconomy, Alchemy, Capsule, and Cometh, any of these third-party providers, or me just deploying you for fun over a 437 wallet. It's impossible to discover that an EOA has one. Not possible. And so I've dubbed this practice because I see it a lot in the gaming side, and honestly just in hackathons and everywhere, which is called detect or deploy, where people and their apps are just natively through zero dev just saying, don't see a 4337 wallet through my own specific way of looking up if you have one, then
make a new one.
Make a new one, yeah. Oh my God. You should go look at Sepolia or Gurley. There's probably a bazillion implementations of them. It's absurd. Absurd. Death by 1,000 accounts. I stole that from somebody's talk at WalletUnconf. on Friday, but like literal death by 1,000 accounts.
No shade, but it certainly improves your numbers if you encourage someone to deploy a new account rather than find an old one. So do you have?
Yeah.
Are you
VCs? If you want to, hire me to do some due diligence for you.
Yeah, I guess true enough. But so your EIPs that you're presenting would essentially emit an event when you deploy so that they could be indexed?
No, it follows OAuth standards. So it's this idea of I'm not sold on this exact pattern. Like, I'm happy to debate it, but it follows OAuth redirects. So like when you log into Google, a user is presented with like a redirect to accounts.google, where then you do your like normal login process flow. And then from there, it redirects you back to the app you're on before. Everybody's really used to this in like Web 2. It does the same thing, but you choose your provider. So like if like for example, Capsule is your KMS provider solution, or Alchemy or Biconomy or SSO.chainsafe.io, is your provider, then you can like go in the Web3 modal, at least that's the idea, and be like, hey, I want to like authenticate myself through their website. And it would on the provider side, you're just simply saying like, okay, I deterministically know how to generate a public key for this user, whether that's through MetaMask, a standard EOA on Ledger, or through passkeys. And then I also deterministically through that process also know how to figure out if I deployed a smart contract wallet for that user or not. And then you're just simply returning that data back to the application. So then they know how to handle that user.
Right. I guess it depends on cooperation from these wallet providers or account providers who are often setting up completely incompatible systems for managing the relationship between the email and the smart account, or whatever the OAuth is on the smart account.
Yeah, exactly.
I think so. So, yeah. Okay, so state bloat for 437 in one way, because 3074 reduces it because there's less approvals and managing of the approval state. 437 increases it because given that there's no discoverability, people are deploying multiple smart accounts, even though the whole idea should probably be that you don't have to do that. On the recent episode with DC Posh and Nalin from Dymo, they mentioned that one of the things about sort of the limited returns in optimizing the P256 R1 verification on-chain smart contracts for L2 deploys is that the majority of the gas that you pay for an L2 transaction against a smart account is more about the data availability, what you're storing on L1, not so much the in-memory compute verifying your signature. So there's kind of like not that much benefit to, as long as you're thinking that your users are on L2, to optimizing the hell out of your P256 smart contract in the absence of 7212 precompile, because at the end of the day, that stuff doesn't get stored on L1, which is where the gas cost comes from. So I don't know if anyone else had anything before we move on, but state bloat of these two EIPs? If not, next question from Kate was regarding replay protection. How do both approaches address replay protection? Maybe Matt, you want to jump in on how 3074 thinks about this?
I'll say for 4337 includes a nonce, and then the outer transaction also has its nonce as well.
Yeah, and 3074 relies on an EOA submitting a transaction, so like that exists there.
Right. She also asked, how do they manage transaction nonces? I guess you kind of answered that, especially in high throughput scenarios where nonce space might become a bottleneck. I don't know if that...
Sorry, I was away from my phone for just a second. I was just wanted to say on 3074, the transaction submitting the 3074 messages has the nonce, but there's actually no nonce in the message that's signed by the EOA account that auth is processing. And that is a very specific design because we want to allow invokers to create whatever kind of nonce mechanism that they feel is necessary for the application which they're utilizing. So the signature for 3074 has only two important parts. One is the type discriminator, which you kind of have something similar with type transactions. That way there's not an overlap. You don't sign a transaction that's a 1559 transaction and accidentally have it interpreted as a 2930 transaction or a legacy transaction. 3074 has its own type byte discriminator, and then you sign over the invoker, which is going to process that message. That way, your signature isn't taken by some other invoker and just executed. And so the thinking behind that is that you're signing a message to an invoker that you trust in some way, which means that that invoker has implemented some sort of nonce mechanism. And it's, again, up to them to decide. And so the question that she also asked is, what do you do in these high throughput situations? And I will say it's, again, up to the invoker. It's up to them to decide if they want to have some sort of parallel nonce mechanism, which allows them to better process a situation where you're trying to push through a bunch of different operations which aren't really tied to each other consecutively.
One final question from Kate was, how would 3074 handle nested execution within an invoker contract? Not sure I totally understand, but maybe, do you know?
I think what they're trying to ask is, if you submit if you call a 3074 invoker and you do the auth, and then you do an auth call, and then somewhere along that call graph, as you keep going deeper and deeper, it comes back to the invoker, and they again call auth with the same EOA, and then they do the auth call. And I don't really see anything particularly wrong with that. Like, yes, it's a weird thing to do. Maybe the question is a bit about, like, how do you deal with this TX origin? Because you might, I mean, there's like two things, I guess. What do you do with TX origin? Right now, the thing we do with TX origin is we sort of, actually, I'm not sure what we've decided to do right now. It's usually been between, do you not change the TX, three things. Do you not change the TX origin? Do you set it to the account that's calling, which would mimic exactly what the transaction would look like if it came from the EOA? Or do you set it to some third value? That way you don't break some invariance that exists. So there's that thing. And then there's also a question about, some contracts might make the assumption that if an EOA called it, then the EOA cannot again call it within the same call graph. And so they might use this as like some sort of really naive flash loan protection mechanism, or maybe some sort of whitelist mechanism. And yeah, I don't really see too much of a problem. There's a bit of nuance in the question, but it's not really a major issue.
Great. EVM Brahman asks, given the momentum of 4337, how will the products being built on 4337 be impacted by 3074? I guess that's dependent on 3074 ever coming to fruition. Will those products be able to benefit from 3074 at all?
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally. So like Matt mentioned the toolbox earlier, and I thought that's a perfect analogy of like the 3074 being a screwdriver. I think that the screwdriver exists, it cuts down half the tools that you're going to need in your box, like to implement 4337.
Greg, did you want to say something on that?
No, that was elegantly put.
Very true. I think that's basically the end of the listener questions. I had one other question. In talking about 4337 with a bunch of teams, Rhinestone, Conrad, and other people, and also this morning, Ahmed from Biconomy, the difference between the safe style contract architecture and diamond style implementations for AA account contracts has come up a few times. I'm curious if anyone has any hot takes on which you prefer, or which makes more sense, or why both maybe make sense. Any ideas on this?
Is the diamond pattern piece referring to EIP 6900, the plugin module system? Because I don't think 4337 actually does anything there.
I thought Diamond Standard was older than that, like 2000s maybe.
What? The diamond, the ERC 777 is the diamond pattern token, right? I don't know what we're talking about.
No, it's a diamond multifacet proxy is 2535. And I think it's in the implementing of a 4337 compliant account contract. You can make choices about how you handle calls between contracts, either doing it the approach that Safe uses, which I'm not personally that familiar with, or the diamond style, which can open you to, I think the danger is like, if you don't carefully manage your storage slots, you could get into trouble by overwriting or being exposed to vulnerabilities if you aren't managing your storage slots carefully as you have contracts interacting with one another. And this is like, I think, a topic in implementing 4337 circles. And it's something that probably developers interacting with these things won't think too deeply about, but it is kind of a contentious issue and unsettled. So it sounds like nobody has deep thoughts on this topic here.
Well, actually, I think I know the problem. I think the problem here is the use of delegate call versus call.
Yes.
But Safe implements that. They just hide it from the UI. Bandtag actually, somebody showcased this the other day, but Banteg explained it really clearly with Dean, where there's two types of transaction types in Safe. And you can actually, transaction type 1 is delegate call, transaction type 2 is call. Safe UI defaults to 2, but you can effectively delegate call directly through a Safe transaction and modify storage. So that's how you can avoid adding owners to the direct link list that's created through the Safe UI, and basically have like an owner that does not show up in the UI because you can't find it through the link list. So I think Safe is actually exploitable in the exact same way, because you can do arbitrary delegate calls directly to the storage slots.
All right. That's a future research topic for me. I'm going to have to look more into that. As we close things out, is there any like last comments or things that we didn't mention that you think are important for people to know about 3074, 4337, or maybe the EIP process? Any final remarks?
If you need an EIP number associated, you just tag lightclients. He'll eventually do it, but you have to give him a hot name. That's it.
That shit better be hot.
Matt, did you have any final thoughts, or you think we covered it?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one last closing thought. If 3074 speaks to you, if you think that this is something that would benefit the protocol, then we need you to share that sentiment and try and help us build some sort of community voice around it, because the core developers, they've just been mostly apathetic to UX changes, and it's really going to take a big community effort, a big community push to make something like 3074 happen. And I honestly think it is possible. I think with 4337, it's such a large and complicated change. I don't see a world where we enshrine it, but I do see a world where 3074 makes it to mainnet. Otherwise, I wouldn't be spending my time talking on Twitter Spaces or unstagnating the EIP every 6 months. So yeah, if it's something that speaks to you, please share with people, reach out to me. I want to make a bigger push for it for the Prague hard fork, which hopefully will happen sometime next year, but you never know. And yeah, thanks a lot for having us on here.
Joseph, any final thoughts?
Yeah, as Matt touched on, the user experience improvement for 3074 is huge. Like right now, essentially, if you want to onboard someone onto Ethereum, you need to have them install a wallet. You need them to onboard ETH, so they have to get ETH from somewhere through Coinbase or through you or whatever. And then they need to, and then from there they can execute their first transaction. With 3074, essentially the user experience goes from that to installing a wallet and having someone sponsor the transaction through like account abstraction and economic abstraction. So like I think that it yields huge benefits for the end user and onboarding the end user.
Awesome. Matt, Greg, Joseph, this was awesome. Thank you so much for coming and chatting about these interesting and deep technical topics. Thank you everyone for coming to listen. If you've enjoyed the show, Web3 Galaxy Brain is going to be in Gitcoin for the first time, hopefully in 5 days. We'll see if they approve my submission. So if you like this conversation, you want to hear more stuff like this, check out web3galaxybrain.com for past episodes and a new upcoming website with like AI transcripts that are searchable and stuff like that. And check out the Gitcoin round that starts November 15th to November 29th. It'll be in the communication and education section, I think it's called. So I appreciate your support a lot. It helps to make the show possible. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody, for coming to listen. See you next week.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Web3 Galaxy Brain. To keep up with everything Web3, follow me on Twitter @Nicholas with 4 leading N's. You can find links to the topics discussed on today's episode in the show notes. Podcast feed links are available at web3galaxybrain.com. Web3 Galaxy Brain airs live most Friday afternoons at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2200 UTC on Twitter Spaces. I look forward to seeing you there.